All right, we're live. So today we will continue our React series, part 2, components. We'll talk a little bit more about components. They're going to be a big part of your life going forward with any front-end framework. And then we'll delve a little bit more into state and props. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the difference between props and state, at least at their core. Be able to write a stateful component that passes data through props. We started to do a little bit of that without putting it in those terms yesterday with app.js as a class component. And then we're going to discuss, you'll be able to discuss a little bit about component hierarchy and architecture. If you recall, we started to kind of track the hierarchy of our app last time, right? We had index, which was basically just handling mounting the app into that div with the ID of root. And then app.js, which we talked about as sort of the heart of the application. You might also call it the brain of the application. And app.js will render components below it. So we'll have a discussion of the hierarchy, why it matters, why state should live in certain places, stuff like that. Any questions on objectives before we get started? All right, cool. So to start off, I want to recap a little bit what we did last time because I went pretty quickly at the end. So actually, I'm going to go ahead and get the app running. So I'll do an npm start. I've got another tab open with the repo so we can work off of that. Actually, let's make sure this was on the right branch. Let's kill that. Yep, it is. Okay. npm start that. We'll get the app up and running. And what we should see is the header kind of as we had it before, with a title of hello world, which we created as a property. Props is short for property. And then 3 paragraphs, all the same, right? Because if we look at our paragraph component, it's like hard-coded, it's static. It's not dynamic right now. It just says to get started, etc. Yes, you actually probably will need to do an npm install. Yeah, with any fresh repo that you're cloning, you're most likely going to have to, if it has any dependencies, if it has a package JSON, you're probably going to need to run npm install. Sorry, I should have specified that. It installs just npm install. Yeah, just npm install, and what it does is it looks at the dependencies for the project and installs all of them.
Sweet.
Yeah, npm install is sort of like catch-all. Just give me everything you got.
Cool.
Sweet. So we'll see these 3 static paragraphs and then a header that we kind of faked into a footer that says goodbye world. So let's check it out. And indeed, that's what we have. So this was sort of our first exploration of props. I want to talk about them a little bit more. This was to kind of show you the benefit of componentizing our code, right? So we have this paragraph component that we can now just call with one simple little line because we've imported it. So we can render as many or as few as we want. And what would be cool, I think, is if these paragraphs had props also. So let's look at the header component. We're passing, I'll zoom this real quick. We're passing the header component a property, which is simply like a key value pair. You can think of it like an attribute on an HTML element, like an ID or a class. Syntax is almost the same, right? Name of the thing equals something else. So props do not need to be this crazy mysterious thing. They are just things, they're data that we get to pass down to a component. And in this case, it's only receiving one property. And that's why if we look at the header component, we've set it up to receive props, which by the way, you can call this anything you want. It's just a parameter of a function, just like any other parameter you've declared. It's a variable, basically. It's something that will exist. So the convention is to call it props, which is short for properties. And then within our render, or within our return, which is what this component actually renders, we're referencing props.title. That's because props is simply an object, and in this case, an object with one key of title and one value of hello world. So if we refactor our component, our header component, to console log props when it's called before returning the HTML or the JSX, what do you guys think we're going to see in the console when we flip back to the app? We'll see, yeah, so we'll see, I heard object, I heard element. How many times are we going to see it? Once? Twice? 3 times? Who thinks 1 time? Who thinks 2 times? Who thinks more than 2 times? Okay, cool. Let's check it out. Open up our dev tools. Okay, let's try refreshing that. Okay, 0 times. I didn't give you the option. So let's zoom this in a little bit. So we see it logged 2 times. And we see that it's just an object like any other object. It's a plain JavaScript object. It's special in the sense that we do a lot with it, but it's just an object. The first log we see is hello world. The second one is goodbye world. The props refers to the whole object. Then .title would, of course, be the string. So why are we seeing it 2 times? Exactly, yeah. So we're passing 2 props. We're rendering 2 headers, I should say, and each of them are receiving a title prop. And so even though we've only written this header component once, and we only have 1 console log, when the app actually renders and puts all the pieces together, all the components together, we have 2 header components, so we see it logging twice. I highly encourage you, if you ever get confused about what data this component's receiving, just go ahead and log props, and then you have a nice baseline. It's sort of like making a call to an API, and when the data comes back, you log it out. Then you can see the structure of what you're dealing with. Yes, question?
This might be getting too ahead, and you can answer it later. Can you console log state?
I could console log state. What do you think is going to happen? Let's see. Yeah, it breaks because state is undefined. So I know we're in React land, but just think of this as a function, right? It's ultimately just a function that returns some JSX. So do we have a state variable anywhere in the scope of this function or this component? No. So that's why state is undefined. We're going to talk, I'm going to table that for right now. It was a good question. And we're going to get into state in a little bit. What I'd like to do right now is I want to refactor. In fact, I want to have you guys work on this. I'd like you to refactor the paragraph component to accept a prop of title, or sorry, content. So rather than have these paragraphs, and you can just delete the extra 2 and just do 1 if you'd like. But similar, you can reference the header component, but refactor paragraph. Right now, it's not set up to take any props, right? Its parameters are empty. So set it up to take in some props, and instead of rendering just this code right here, this static text, let's make it render whatever it's passed through props as content. So that would be props.content, right? Any questions on, or clarifications required on what your task is for the next few minutes? Okay, cool. I'm gonna put like 4 minutes on the board. Try to refactor your paragraph component to accept props, to render content from props, and then when you're rendering it in app.js, pass it some content. Pass it something that we could eventually make dynamic. And I'm gonna do, we'll do 4 minutes. And it's okay if you don't finish in that time. If you finish early, you can play around with adding some more props to it and rendering some more stuff within that paragraph component. And if you're feeling totally stuck, you can raise your hand. I'll be wandering around. I would call it oh yeah. Yeah, I
I know they're really good. I want to use that level
It's your one next to it, but
yes. Good. It's up there. Why not in this series? Yes. This is a little more. Yeah. Yeah. Spain
How's everyone doing on time? Good? Should we add a little more? Let's do another minute. Sorry. Ah, it's horrible. Yeah, sorry everybody. All right, let's come back together and let's modify our code together now. So I want to kind of just whip around. So our task was refactor our paragraph component to be able to receive props in the first place. Make it so that it's rendering content. You could call it text. You could call it whatever you want to call it, but some string that it's going to receive, right? And then pass it that property where it gets rendered. So first part, let's refactor the paragraph component. So someone help me. Someone from this table. Let's take a volunteer. What's the first thing I need to add to my code? Dan.
Would just be in the p tag, within the p tag.
Yeah.
You can get rid of that text.
Sweet.
Or you can copy it if that's what you want.
Yeah, let's get rid of it entirely.
Cool. Let's get rid of it.
Yeah.
And then in curly braces, you do props.content.
Nice, props.content. Sweet, beautiful. Back table. What else do I need to add to this component?
You need to add props to the parameters.
Yes, I need to add props to the parameters. Excellent. Back table. What do I need to do now in app.js to have this paragraph receive props? Space, yep. Content, whoops. Content equals whatever, let's just write that. A string, whatever you want. Cool. So we wired paragraph up to receive props. It's a content key on there. And then we pass it the content that we want here in app.js. And if we go back to our application, we get nothing. Hard to refresh. There we go. And now our paragraph says whatever you want. So now this is starting to become a little more useful, right? Our components are dynamic. We can render stuff to them dynamically. If we wanted to now, we could add a couple more paragraphs and without having to rewrite any of that HTML or any potential logic within that component, we just pass it what it wants and needs and it does its thing. Almost like magic. I'm probably going to have to hard refresh, so I'll just do that right off the bat. Cool. Now we have this awesome reusable paragraph component. Granted, paragraph is not doing much more than a regular p tag would, but you can imagine as this builds in complexity, you have components that are rendering a bunch of HTML and receive a few different props and just template them in to that block of code wherever they're needed. Very cool. So, questions about what we needed to do to modify the paragraph component, what we needed to do in app.js. Questions on this, like a component receiving props and rendering it. Give you 10 seconds to think about it. All right, 5 seconds is good enough. Any questions? Okay, cool. Let's move on for right now. So, you do?
No.
Okay, cool. So let's go back to the README. We want to be able to explain the difference between props and state. So what I'd like you to do here is open up this component state section of the docs, the React docs. Now we have a bit of grounding in what props are and how we can use them. It's like something that comes sort of like from above us and we render. Let's now try to figure out what props are in relation to state. So I'd like you to read, they've got a section right here. What's the difference between state and props? So read this first part, really just this first part of this section of the documentation. And because we're going to talk a lot more about setting state and things like that. So really just focus on this first part. What's the difference? If you want to look up other resources to try and clarify it, like they link some additional resources here. Let's do 2 minutes to read since it's relatively short, and then we'll do some group discussion. So we'll do a 2-minute timer. About another minute or so. Another 20 seconds or so. All right, last few seconds for reading. I'm going to stop this before it beeps. Let's avoid that. All right, cool. Let's do another 2 minutes. Let's do a turn and talk with someone next to you, someone at your table, and talk about state, talk about props. What's the difference between them? And then we'll talk all together.
Yeah. So I guess this is where it's like state or this whole thing
About 30 seconds left. All right, last few seconds. Please wrap up your conversations. All right, I heard some really good stuff. Really good stuff. So let's take some notes together. What the heck are the difference between props and state? Here, we'll just take this right from our first objective. Grab some notes here. I'll just take volunteers. Who has some thoughts on props and state and what the difference is between them? Yeah.
So I wrote that props represent a component's options and can pass in like function parameters. And then I have that state is managed within the component like a variable declared in the function.
Nice. Props represent a component's options and are passed to a component. Finish what you had there?
Like a function's parameters.
Like a function's, yes, I like that a lot. Like a function's parameters slash arguments. Cool. And then state?
Is managed within the component, a variable declared in a function.
Oh, I love it. Like a variable. Man, I can't type today. Declared in a function. Very nice. Great. That is an excellent starting point. Sweet. Who wants to add to this? Who's got something to add to this? This is a pretty freaking good start. Yeah.
Components only state if they're interactable, I think.
So let's say their own state if they are like interactive. I'm gonna slash need to. I'm gonna. Yeah, I'm gonna leave that for right now. I'm gonna leave that for right now. It's possible to have stateless components, functional components that can trigger activity, but if we're doing that, we're usually needing to change state. So we can trigger actions in functional components, but the actual like code is running in the component that has the state. So yeah, let's leave that. I like that. Yeah, Mike. What?
And for another one, you could say you cannot directly access another component's state.
Yes, I love that. That is awesome. Let's copy that and put that under state here. You cannot directly access another component's state. And that kind of goes along with state being managed within the component. It's sort of this insular thing. And so what's kind of the flip side of if state is this internal thing, then where do props come from?
Properties are passed down from like the tenant.
Yeah, properties are passed down. Properties are like inherited or received. They're sort of passive in that sense. They're read only. They're not something that we change directly, ever really. Say that again, Kevin.
Properties are passed down from
Props are passed down from a parent. I'm just going to add they, quote, come from above. And they are read only. So if we want to change a prop, oftentimes a prop is passed, oftentimes a part of state is passed as a prop. So we have state, let's look back at our hierarchy. In fact, let's add to our hierarchy, right? We have some more components now. So I'm going to grab a shape. So we now have a header component, and let's just copy that. And we have a paragraph component. And actually, depending on how much you refactored, you may have multiple paragraph components. But in terms of the hierarchy, we just represent it as one. However many are actually rendered is a different story. So app.js now renders a header and rendered. What happened to that connection? And okay, whatever. You get the point. Renders, app.js is rendering header and paragraph. Right now, paragraph and header both just kind of are receiving some props that we've hard-coded in here. What we're going to do next is move this stuff onto state, and then we can pass state to these components, but they'll receive it as props. And that's a really important distinction. Well said, Kevin. Anything else we should add here? Or any questions also? Questions on state and props and the difference. They're very related, but also importantly different. Going once? Going twice? Okay, cool. This is a really nice list. I like this a lot. We'll move that back in. So let's write a stateful component that passes data through props. Well, we already have a stateful component in app.js. Right now, our application is smaller in scope, right? We want to start small and build up. So we kind of have the write a class component thing down, just in terms of our app came with one. And if we need to write another, we could model it after this. If you would like to write another one from scratch, certainly be my guest. But let's refactor this component to be able to have state. So actually, let's take a look at the docs here. I want to point out also, props and state are both plain JavaScript objects. Like there's a tendency to like mystify them in React. All they are is an object that is either available within a class or available within a function, like available within a component, whatever type it is, as essentially like the data that's meaningful to that component. And one of the benefits of having state, for the most part, controlled in one place is that we can then split off pieces of it and pass it to different components. So let's go back to our app. And I don't love how everything's hard-coded, right? Part of the point is that we want to move towards dynamic behavior. So let's make state. Honestly, the simplest way to make state on a class component is to just write state equals and then an object. This is sort of a shorthand syntax. In a lot of the documentation, what you're going to see is a constructor, which takes in props, and then like super props, and then this dot state equals an object. So A constructor, the essence of a constructor is it's a function that gets called when the class itself is being created. And so it sets an initial starting point for the whole class. This is the way you're going to see it mostly in the documentation. It's honestly, it's verbose. It's not that bad, right? And the most important part is right here when you're setting state. And we use the this keyword, which is context sensitive in JavaScript. In the context of a class or an object, this refers to the object itself. So what we're doing here in the constructor is we're saying reference this whole class, this whole object. Just think of a class as an object, and then set a state property on it equal to an object. So it's just like having, if an object represents the whole class, you have a key, that's state, that is another object that has key value pairs inside of it. I'm drawing a lot of curly braces now, and it's starting to feel weird. The bottom line for right now, you're going to see this in documentation, so I wanted to show it to you. And feel free to set your initial state this way. Also know that with some of the cool features that Create React App has under the hood, this is newer syntax that isn't fully like into the JS language yet, but Create React App like spits out the code that we need on the other side. It transpiles this into like ES5 code. So you can set your state however you want. I really prefer to do it this way because I'm usually not doing anything special in the constructor anyways. So let's do it like this so we can just think of it as the regular object it is. So what would be a meaningful thing to put on the state of this application?
An array of strings.
Oh my God, I love it. An array of strings. What type of strings?
The ones that you're passing to the object.
Yeah, so like maybe these paragraph content strings. So let's make a key of content and set it as an array. And let's extract these strings into that array. So yeah, let's just do that. Actually, I'm going to leave them. I'm just going to copy them for right now because we'll work with this array in a moment. And then I want to do a little bit of a simpler example, and then we'll move into working with this array on state. But I love where your head's at. So I'm just going to copy those, get those on state. And then what else might make sense to have on state? Title. Yeah, let's do title. And we'll do title. And don't forget your commas, right? Because we're in an object. Title will be, we'll just do hello world, and we'll maybe scrap the second header component. So title hello world. Nothing crazy going on, just an object, almost like any other. Now, you mentioned console logging state earlier, and we couldn't do that because we're in a functional component that has no state. Now we are in a class component, so we can get access to state, but we can't just start logging stuff like here, right? We need to be in an actual function block. So what we can do is in the render function, before the return, we can do whatever we want. So we can log state in here. But there's still going to be an issue if we just console log state. Does anybody know? Well, let's see what happens.
You have to reference the class first.
First, it's just going to work. Then I'll hard refresh, and now it breaks. But yeah, we get the same thing. State's not defined. So say what you said again.
You have to reference the class by saying this dot state.
Yes, this is critical. Whenever you're in a class component, whenever you're in a stateful component, you need to reference state or props, because class components can receive props also. This one doesn't have any because there's nothing really above it passing it stuff. But we can console log this dot state now. And when we go back to our app, when we refresh, cool. We see, well, actually, let's put a label on it. So let's do state. So we still have those logs of props, I believe. But here's state. Here's the state of app.js. And since it's the only stateful component, it's sort of the state of our whole application. Again, just an object with now a content property that's an array and a title property that's hello world. Sweet. questions on the basics of making a stateful component? Seems to make sense? Cool. Give me a quick fist of 5 on how confident you feel in refactoring or writing a class component and refactoring app.js to have state. 0 is I have no idea. 5, I got this. Okay, cool. Sweet. We'll move on for right now. So your task now, don't worry about the paragraphs for this moment. If you want to tackle rendering a bunch of paragraphs with a loop, say, and passing them their relevant content values, go ahead. But that's a stretch goal for the next few minutes. The real goal for right now is refactor this header to receive the title from state. So we no longer have a hard-coded string value in there. If you want to refactor this one to have it as well, yeah, I might as well just do both of them for right now. Yeah, let's do 3 minutes to work on that, and then we'll get into something a little bit more complex.
Last night, and I fell asleep with my laptop next to my bed, and I normally just wake up in the morning and just grab my laptop, grab my backpack. I just grab my backpack this morning. I've done that before.
Last couple seconds. I'm going to stop this before it beeps. Sweet. Let's refactor together now. So the task was to refactor our header component to, or the where it's being rendered, to no longer have a hard-coded string, but to reference it from state. So I'm just going to take a volunteer. Who can help me? Who can help me do this? Yeah, Matt.
This.state.type.
Sweet. So
Back to console items, go down the list.
yeah, so we'll change hello world within our curlies, right? This is where we can execute Regular old JavaScript. And we'll get rid of the hard-coded string, and now we reference it from state. So this to reference the whole class, state to get us into the state object, and .title, which should resolve into hello world. And let's just change it a little bit so it's not exactly the same. I don't know why I always have to hard refresh. Cool, now we have hello world again. Now we have this wired up to be a lot more dynamic, because now all we have to do is change state, bless you, and our application should change without us having to mess around at all with the logic of what's actually being rendered. So again, we're working with a simple example right now, but eventually we're going to have other parts of this application that can modify state, and then any components that are depending on it, React will detect that there's a change in the data, and then this will receive the new data, so it'll re-render. Did anybody tackle rendering paragraphs dynamically? Yeah. Or was that a question?
No.
You want? Let's get it started.
So this dot is content and whatever the text.
Cool. Yeah. This.state.content at index 0. We could change this one to basically be the same, right? This.state.content at index 1, and this.state.content at index 2. So this should still work, right? We'll refresh just to make sure. And indeed, it still works. Very nice. However, were you going to suggest something different? Okay, cool. So Tom is saying, is there a way to map through it? So I think I mentioned to many of you during higher order functions in Candy Shop, like if you walk away with one thing, feel good about map, because we're going to be doing a heck of a lot of mapping in React. And this is actually where React starts to become a lot more powerful and flexible. Yeah, Jeff, question.
Real quick, I was watching your videos and like you did sort of map on that's amazing, but I realized is React amazing or is map amazing?
So I would say, so is map amazing or is React amazing? I say both. But like together they're super amazing. Map is incredible. Map I use more than any other native array method. That being said, what React allows us to do is instead of just take an array and change it into another array, we can take an array of data, right? Like content, like anything, any string or array of objects, that's data, right? Oftentimes when you hit an API, it comes back with an array of objects. We can take that array of data, map through it, and turn it into actual React components that are going to get spit out. So before we move on to that, just want to ask if there are any questions on referencing values from state so that we get some more dynamic stuff happening, passing state through props. Okay, cool. Great. So let's do some magic now. You can write, again, React is a little flexible. You can write some of this in line, like inside of your return. I prefer to do the logic of creating like an array of components, which is what we're going to do in the render function, but above the return. So let me get rid of our console log because we verified what our state is. And what I want to do is access this content array. And for each item of content, so 3 items, we'll render a paragraph that receives the appropriate string as props. I know that sounds like a lot, so I'm just going to show you, and then we can pull it apart. So first I'm going to make a variable. I'm going to do, call it paragraphs. Const paragraphs equals this.state.content. So that this, again, references the whole class. State gets us to this object. Content gets us to this array, right? So we now have an array. And what can we do with arrays? We can use native array methods. Let's map through it. And what would be a good like kind of semantic name to represent the current element in the iteration? Wait, words? What did you say over here? Item, element. I like words the most. I'm going to say sentence because it's a collection of words. So for each sentence, so sentence will be our parameter, and then fat arrow function, and normally we would like return, sentence plus something else, or we would manipulate this data in some way. Now what we're going to do is we're going to manipulate it into a component. So we'll return a paragraph component. I'm just going to cut it right out of there. In fact, I'm going to delete both of these. We'll leave an empty space. So we'll return a whole paragraph component and pass it the right content. So what is content now? What's the right content in the context of this code block? Sentence. I heard it from a bunch of people. Exactly right. So let's pump sentence in there. And now we're flexing the muscles of our native array methods combined with React's components. And right now, our sentences have just disappeared from the page, right? Because we're not rendering anything. We just deleted those paragraphs. But we're storing the results of this whole map in a constant called paragraphs. So all we have to do to get all of them in there is just open up curlies so we can template in, we can use JavaScript, and just reference our variable, an array of components with data. So now we go back. Okay, we'll deal with that. That's a warning. We go back, and now we've reduced our code once again. Our code is super, super dry. We're only even writing the paragraph element one time, and we're passing it all this data dynamically. So the content array could be 3 things long. It could be 3 million things long. That'll probably slow down your browser, but it would still render out, right? We didn't have to write any extra code. We basically just wrote it as if there were one paragraph receiving one sentence.
So why do you write it?
Remember, we don't have, we need to be in a code block to write our JavaScript code. If we were in like a functional component, we can just do it right within the function block, like our console log. But within a class, like if we move this logic outside the class, or as part of the class, we can't declare constants there. Because the class is like an object, so.
You write the constant paragraphs into a function.
Yeah, totally.
Call that function inside the return.
Yeah, we could.
So like paragraph.
For right now, I want to move it back down. I want to ask if anyone has questions on what's going on here. Because this is, once this clicks in, this is like, oh my God, this is beautiful. But until it does, it's like my head hurts. So any questions? I want you to think on it for a good 10 seconds if you have any questions.
Do you need the paragraph content equals, or could you just have sentences inside?
Say that again?
Could you get rid of the paragraph contents, like the return paragraph contents, and just have sentences?
So you could, if you want to take advantage of some more syntax, which is an implicit return, and if this doesn't make any sense to you right now, don't worry about it. You can delete the return, and you can convert these two curlies.
No, I think you meant like instead of passing props with paragraphs, you're like rendering it in your return with these paragraphs. Instead of passing props right there, you have to do that.
Well, if we don't pass props, then we lose. It's not going to have. They're not going to have any content.
Pass the props, but just get rid of the paragraph content. Like the word, like what you put calls.
This?
So you want it to call that same, you want it to pass it and you props it.
Yeah. So exactly right, Eldon. So paragraph. This is we're saying return an element, return like a JavaScript component. So if we don't have paragraph in here, it doesn't know. Like it's going to have no idea what to do. Because our paragraph component is the component that's set up to receive a content prop.
Never mind.
Okay, cool. Yeah, okay. Any other questions? Because
I'm curious about what paragraphs actually looks like, because the map returns an array of JSX, which is being executed somehow in that return statement.
yep,
So React just knows to execute the array.
yeah. That's a great question though. Let's look at the actual DOM. Uh-oh. Computer's unhappy. Huh. Oh, well, we can deal with that, but I should still be able to pull my dev tools out. In any case, let's go to elements. Zoom this out a little bit. So this is just the stuff, right, that we saw in the index.html in the public folder. This file's a template, right? That's what's coming from right here. This HTML file's a template. And then we have our div ID of root. Open that up. Div class app. And then we just get the actual HTML of the 3 paragraphs. So yeah, essentially like React is smart enough to allow us to do this. Yeah. And that's where, is map just magical or is React just magical? It's both. Sweet.
What is that error?
So yeah, so let's talk about that error real quick and then we'll wrap up. So each child in an array or iterator should have a unique key prop. Check the render method of app. So what's happening is React is complaining a little bit that we've rendered an array of very similar things and we haven't uniquely identified them. So React is doing so much work under the hood with the DOM and keeping track of so many things that sometimes we need to throw it a bone and help it out, basically. So it's really not a big deal. All that we need is, as it says, should have a unique key prop. So how do we create props? Yeah, we pass it when we're rendering it. So we literally just do key equals. We'll make a little space here and zoom it. So key equals, and this needs to be something unique within this particular iteration. That's probably the best way to handle it. Given that, like a lot of times when data is coming from an API, it's an object with an ID, a unique ID. So oftentimes I'll use that for my unique identifier. In this case, we're inside of a map, so as Austin's suggesting, if we declare another parameter, we can grab the index value at the current loop, the current iteration. So we'll wrap sentence in parentheses, and we'll declare the index, because that's the order of map. First item is always the current item in the iteration, or first parameter. Second parameter is always the index of the current iteration. And what we can do is just pump in index, and we go back over and refresh. Yay, our warning has gone away. They are just warnings. They won't break your app, but they're relatively easy to take care of those, so you might as well as you're doing it. Sweet. Let's check our objectives. So we talked a little bit about component hierarchy and architecture. We're going to be making our app a lot more dynamic and complex next time. So aside from our brief discussion, I'm going to put that off until next time, and we'll touch this up with state and flow of props and flow of data and changing state and stuff like that. So we'll push that one for today. For right now, who can give me the quick hits? Oh, geez, it's kind of hard with the notes right there too. Who can give me the quick hits on the difference between props and state? In their own words. Maybe someone just, what are props? Props are data, passing data to a child or data received by a child component. Yes, and we can pass pieces of the state as props. That the most common pattern you're going to see in React is one component has state and distributes parts of it as props throughout the app. Nice. So then what is state? What are some important things about state? Someone from this table.
State is handled, I guess, within the component, like a variable would be within the component.
Yes, state is handled by, beautifully said. I'm not even going to say it again. Cool, and I think Kevin touched on the relationship between them very nicely. So what do we need to do to a stateful or a class component to add state to it? Yeah, state equals an object. It can be done in more complex ways, but at its core, you can do this. Unless you need to be doing something fancy in the constructor, do it this way. You are going to see that constructor syntax in a lot of the documentation, though, so I don't want you to be thrown off by seeing that. And you need commas, yes, because it is an object and it will break everything. Nice. All right, sweet. So we'll talk more about component hierarchy and architecture next time. I'll get this code uploaded. I'll get this video uploaded. Thank you all so much for your time.